the old quarter of Palermo, on a street that smells like jasmine and diesel and stone that has been warm for 2,000 years, there is a monastery. It belongs to the Capuchin order, brown-robed monks who took vows of poverty and silence and built their house on a hill above the city in the 16th century. The monastery is still active. Monks still live there. They still pray. They still tend the gardens. They still walk the cloisters in sandals worn smooth by centuries of identical footsteps. But the monastery is not what people come to see. Below the monastery, carved into the rock of the hill, is a network of corridors, cool, dry, lit by bare electric bulbs that replaced candles only in the last century. The corridors are narrow, the ceilings are low. The air smells like dust and something faintly chemical, a residue of vinegar and arsenic that is never fully dissipated. And lining the walls of those corridors, standing, hanging, lying in open coffins, propped in alcoves, arranged on shelves, are approximately 8,000 mummified human bodies. They are not skeletons. They are bodies. Many still have skin, hair, fingernails. Some wear the clothes they were buried in: suits, dresses, military uniforms, clerical robes. Some have their jaws open as if caught mid-sentence. Some have their arms folded. Some have their arms at their sides. Some are standing upright, held in place by hooks and wire. And many of them, their eyes are open, not eye sockets, not empty orbits. Open eyes, dried, sunken, but aimed, directed, looking into the corridors they face, watching whatever passes in front of them. The Capuchin Catacombs of Palermo are one of the most visited sites in Sicily. Over 100,000 tourists walk through them every year. They take photographs. They post them on social media. They describe the experience as creepy and macabre and fascinating. They spend an hour underground. Then they go back into the sunlight and eat granita and forget. They walk past 8,000 watchers, and they don't ask the only question that matters. What are they watching? The official history is straightforward. In 1599, the Capuchin monks began mummifying their dead. The first body was Brother Silvestro of Gubbio. He was placed in the catacombs beneath the monastery as a mark of respect. Other monks followed. Then wealthy Palermitans requested the same treatment, a way to preserve their bodies and be visited by their families after death. Over the following 3 centuries, the practice expanded. Professionals, military officers, women, children. The catacombs grew. New corridors were excavated. By the time the practice officially ended in 1920, approximately 8,000 bodies had been interred. The mummification process was specific. The body was placed in a collatoio, a sealed drying chamber, for 8 months. Fluids drained through a grate in the floor. The body desiccated. It was then washed with vinegar, dressed in clothes chosen by the family, and placed in the catacombs. Some were treated with arsenic or other preservatives. The result was remarkable. Bodies that retained their form, their features, their expression. Bodies that looked not like the dead, but like the living, paused. That is the history you will find in any guidebook. It is accurate. It is also incomplete, because it does not explain the arrangement. 8,000 bodies, organized not randomly, but according to a specific system. Monks in one corridor, professional men in another, women in a third, children and virgins in a fourth, officers in a fifth. The corridors connect in a pattern. They branch and rejoin. They circle back on themselves. If you map them from above, if you trace the layout of the catacombs as a single drawing, the corridors form a shape. The shape is a spiral, not an approximate spiral, not a vaguely circular layout. A precise, deliberate spiral that begins at the entrance and winds inward, deeper, narrower, until it reaches a point at the very center of the network. A point that is not on any tourist map. A point that is closed to the public. a point behind a wooden door that has been locked for as long as anyone at the monastery can remember. The monks call it la stanza chiusa, the closed room. If you ask what is inside, the monks will tell you it is an old storage area, unsafe, structurally compromised, nothing of interest. But the 8,000 bodies in the catacombs are not facing the entrance. They are not facing the tourists. They are not facing each other. Every body in the Capuchin catacombs faces inward, toward the center, toward the spiral's end, toward La Stanza Chiusa. 8,000 pairs of open eyes, staring in the same direction, toward a locked door that no one opens. The people of Palermo have a phrase for the catacombs that the tourist brochures do not include. They call them La Prigione degli Occhi, the prison of the eyes. Not a prison for the dead, a prison built from them, a prison whose bars are not iron or stone, but sight, observation, the unbroken gaze of 8,000 witnesses aimed at a single point, because what is behind that door has been there since before the monks, before the Normans, before the Arabs, before the Romans and the Greeks, since the Phoenicians carved the first chamber into the rock of this hill 3,000 years ago and sealed something inside it, something that cannot move while it is being watched. These are 3 accounts from people who came too close to what the dead are guarding. The first story was sent to me by a woman named Giulia. She was 27, an architectural conservator from Rome, and she had been contracted by the Soprintendenza di Palermo to conduct a structural assessment of the catacombs in preparation for a restoration project. Her job was to map the physical condition of the corridors, the walls, ceilings, floors, support structures, check for moisture damage, subsidence, cracking, standard conservation work. She had done similar assessments in catacombs in Rome and Naples. She was comfortable underground. She was comfortable around the dead. What she was not comfortable with was the feeling she had from the first day. She described it carefully. She said it was not fear, not unease. It was the sensation of being observed, constantly, intensely, by something that was paying very close attention. She told me she understood the irony. She was surrounded by 8,000 bodies with open eyes. Of course, she felt watched. It was a psychological response to the visual stimulus of thousands of faces aimed in her direction. Except, they weren't aimed in her direction. On her second day, while mapping the corridor of the professional men, she noticed what every visitor notices subconsciously, but few articulate consciously. The bodies were not looking at her. They were looking past her, over her shoulder, through her, toward something behind her and below her and further in. She turned around. The corridor stretched into dim light, more bodies on both sides, all facing the same direction, inward, deeper. Giulia followed their gaze. She walked the corridor in the direction the bodies were looking. The passage curved, narrowed, connected to another corridor. More bodies, same orientation. She kept walking. The spiral tightened. The ceilings got lower, the light dimmer, the bodies older. Earlier mummifications from the 1600s, their clothes disintegrated, their skin darker, their faces more compressed. She walked until she reached a wall. The corridor ended, except it didn't. There was a door, wooden, dark with age, a heavy iron lock that showed no signs of recent use, no handle, just the lock and the wood and the stone frame. La stanza chiusa. She stood in front of the door. The corridor behind her was lined with the oldest bodies in the catacombs, all facing her, all facing the door. And then she felt something she had never felt in any catacomb, any crypt, any underground space in 15 years of conservation work. Warmth. The door was warm, not the ambient temperature of the corridor, which was a steady 16 degrees. The wood of the door was noticeably warmer. She placed her palm flat against it. 20 degrees, maybe more, heat radiating from the other side, from inside the sealed room. She pressed her ear to the wood. She told me she doesn't know why she did this. She's a scientist. She assesses structures. She doesn't press her ear to locked doors in catacombs like a character in a horror film. But she did. She heard breathing, not the sound of air moving through a crack. Breathing. Inhalation. Exhalation. Slow. Deep. Rhythmic. Coming from directly behind the door. from something that was very close to the other side of the wood. She stepped back. The breathing continued. She could hear it without pressing her ear to the door. It was getting louder, or closer, as if whatever was producing it had been at the far end of the room when she first listened, and was now approaching the door. Julia walked back through the corridor. She did not run. She walked, past the bodies, past the open eyes, through the spiral, out of the catacombs, into the courtyard of the monastery, into the sunlight. She sat on a stone bench for 20 minutes. Then she went to find the monastery's prior, the senior monk. She told him what she had heard. The prior was an old man, 70-something, thin, calm. He listened to her without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You went to the door." She said yes. He said, "How long did you stand in front of it?" She said a few minutes, maybe 3. His expression changed, very slightly, a tightening around the eyes. He said, 3 minutes. Did you look away from the door during those 3 minutes? She thought about it. She said no. She had been looking at the door the entire time, first examining the wood, then pressing her ear to it. The prior nodded slowly. He said, "Good." Julia asked what was behind the door. The prior said, "Something that the brothers have been responsible for since 1599. Something that was here before us, before anyone." She asked what it was. He said, "It doesn't have a name that you would recognize. The Phoenicians who first found it gave it a name in their language. The Arabs who sealed the chamber gave it another. We don't use either name. We simply call it l'hospite, the guest." Julia asked why the door was warm. The prior said, "Because it is alive. It generates heat the way any living thing generates heat. It has been alive behind that door for longer than this city has existed." She asked why they didn't destroy it. The prior's answer was the sentence that Julia said she has replayed in her mind every day since. "We cannot. It cannot be killed. It cannot be moved. It cannot be contained by walls or locks or stone. It can only be contained by one thing." He paused. "Observation, witness, eyes. As long as something is looking at it, as long as an unbroken line of sight connects it to a watcher, it is fixed. It cannot move. It cannot act. It is frozen in place by the act of being seen." He gestured toward the entrance to the catacombs. "That is why they are here. 8,000 bodies, 8,000 pairs of open eyes, arranged in a spiral so that no angle is uncovered, no line of sight is broken. Every inch of every corridor between the entrance and that door is watched continuously by the dead." Julia asked what would happen if the bodies were removed, if the eyes closed, if the line of sight was broken. The prior said it would reach the door, then the corridor, then the catacombs, then the monastery, then the city. He looked at her. "It is fast, faster than anything you can imagine. The only thing that stops it is being seen. The moment observation ceases, even for an instant, it moves." The Phoenicians learned this. The cost of that lesson was a city that no longer exists. Julia finished her structural assessment. She filed her report. She recommended that no restoration work be performed on the inner corridors of the spiral. She cited structural instability as the reason. She did not mention the door, or the breathing, or the prior's words. She told me one final detail. She said that while she was working in the catacombs over the following weeks, she paid attention to the bodies in a way she hadn't before, not as specimens, as sentinels. She studied their positions, their angles, the direction of their gaze, and she found something that disturbed her more than the breathing behind the door. Some of the bodies had shifted. The conservators' records from the 1980s included photographs of every corridor. Julia compared those photographs with current conditions. In the corridors closest to the locked door, the oldest bodies, the ones from the 1600s. Several had changed position. Not fallen, not slumped, turned. Their heads had rotated, away from the door, toward the walls, toward the floor, as if they had been forced to look away. Not all of them, only a few, maybe a dozen out of the hundreds in the deepest corridors. But a dozen was enough. A dozen watchers no longer watching meant a dozen gaps in the line of sight, a dozen blind spots in the spiral, a dozen moments when the thing behind the door was not being observed. Julia said she has not been back to Palermo, but she checks every few months. She contacts the conservators. She asks about the inner corridors. She asks if any more bodies have shifted. The answer each time is yes. The second story was sent to me by a man named Marco. He was 43, a Palermitan, born and raised in the Capo district, less than 2 kilometers from the Capuchin monastery. He worked as an electrician. In 2018, the monastery contracted him to upgrade the lighting in the catacombs, replace the old incandescent bulbs with modern LED fixtures, improve the circuits, install emergency lighting. It was a straightforward job. 3 weeks. Most of the work was in the public corridors, the sections tourists walked through. The monks gave him access during closing hours. He would arrive at 6 in the evening after the last tourists left and work until midnight or later. He told me the first week was fine, uncomfortable, but fine. Working alone in a catacomb surrounded by mummified bodies is not pleasant, but Marco was Palermitan. He had visited the catacombs as a child. He had grown up hearing stories about them. He was not easily unnerved. The discomfort started in the second week when his work moved to the deeper corridors, the sections beyond the tourist route. The older corridors where the bodies were more deteriorated and the air was closer and the light was worse. He noticed 2 things. First, the temperature gradient. The deeper he went, the warmer the corridors became. Not by much, a degree or 2, but consistently, as if there were a heat source at the center of the catacomb network. His thermal laser, a tool he used to check electrical connections, confirmed it. 16 degrees near the entrance, 17 in the middle corridors, 19 in the deepest passages. Second, the sound when the catacombs were empty, when there were no tourists, no monks, no other workers, and Marco was alone in the deep corridors. He could hear something, very faint, at the threshold of perception, a rhythmic sound, low frequency. He described it as like someone breathing through a wall. It was loudest at the end of the innermost corridor, near the locked door. Marco told me he was not curious about the door. He did not want to know what was behind it. He was a practical man. His job was wiring, not mysteries. He installed the new lighting, circuit by circuit, corridor by corridor, working from the outside in. On the 15th night, he was installing the final fixtures in the corridor directly adjacent to the locked door. The last section, the deepest point of the spiral. The bodies here were the oldest in the catacombs. Some were barely recognizable as human. Dried husks and fragments of cloth. But their faces were intact, and their eyes were open, fixed, staring at the door 5 meters away. Marco was on a ladder connecting a junction box near the ceiling. His back was to the corridor. His back was to the door. The new LED fixtures he had installed throughout the catacombs were on a single circuit controlled by a master breaker. He had been testing them as he went. They were bright, clinical. They illuminated the corridors in a way the old, incandescent bulbs never had. Every detail of every body was visible, every face, every eye. He finished the connection. He climbed down the ladder. He walked back through the corridor to the electrical panel to activate the new circuit for the final section. He flipped the breaker, and every light in the catacombs went out. Not the new ones, all of them. The old fixtures, the emergency lights, the construction lamps he had set up for his work. Everything. Total darkness. Marco stood in complete blackness, 8,000 bodies on every side of him. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He reached for his phone. The screen lit up. The corridor materialized in the pale blue glow. Bodies on his left, bodies on his right, faces, eyes, all facing inward, all facing the door behind him. And from behind him, from the direction of the locked door, he heard something that was not breathing. It was movement, not footsteps. Something being dragged, something heavy shifting against stone. A slow, scraping sound, like something that had been still for a very long time, was beginning to move. Marco ran. He told me this without embarrassment. He ran through the dark catacombs by the light of his phone, through the spiral, past the bodies, through corridors he had memorized over 2 weeks of work. He ran until he reached the stairs. He climbed them. He burst into the monastery courtyard. The lights in the catacombs came back on by themselves approximately 4 minutes later. Marco watched from the courtyard as the glow returned to the stairwell. The old bulbs, the construction lamps, everything back on, as if nothing had happened. A circuit breaker does not trip and then reset itself 4 minutes later. Marco checked the panel the next day. No breaker had tripped. The wiring was intact. There was no electrical explanation for a total blackout across multiple independent circuits. He told the prior what happened. The prior listened. Then he asked one question. When the lights went out, were you facing the door or facing away? Marco said he was facing away, his back to the door. The prior closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said, for 4 minutes, every light in the catacombs was off. 8,000 watchers were in darkness. 8,000 pairs of eyes could not see, and your back was turned. He opened his eyes. Do you understand what I'm telling you? For 4 minutes, nothing was watching it. Nothing was between it and the corridor. And you were standing in its path with your back turned. Marco asked why it hadn't reached him. The prior said, your phone. You turned on your phone. The screen lit up. For a moment, a fraction of a second, the light from your screen illuminated the corridor behind you. It illuminated the door. And in that fraction of a second, you saw the corridor. You were a witness. One pair of eyes, for one moment. And that was enough. It stopped. He paused. If you had stood in the dark without turning on your phone, even for 10 more seconds, you would not have heard it moving. You would have felt it on the back of your neck. And by then, it would have been too late to look. Marco finished the job the next day, in daylight, with every light in the catacombs on. He has not been back underground. He told me one more thing. He said that when he was running through the corridors in the dark by the light of his phone, he looked at the bodies he was passing. He couldn't help it. The phone's glow swept across them as he ran, and the ones closest to the door, in the deepest corridor, the ones whose heads had been facing inward when he installed the lights hours earlier, were facing the other way. Their heads had turned. In the 4 minutes of darkness, the oldest, most desiccated, most fragile mummies in the catacombs had turned their heads away from the door, as if they couldn't bear to see what was coming through it. The third story concerns Rosalia Lombardo, and it concerns what she is. Rosalia Lombardo died on December 6, 1920. She was 2 years old. Pneumonia. Her father, Mario Lombardo, was devastated. He asked the embalmer Alfredo Salafia to preserve her. Salafia used a formula of formalin, zinc salts, alcohol, salicylic acid, and glycerin. The result was the most perfectly preserved mummy in the world. Rosalia looks like a sleeping child. Her skin is intact. Her hair is blonde and still tied with a yellow ribbon. Her eyelashes are visible. Her cheeks are round. She lies in a small glass coffin in a chapel at the end of the catacombs. She's been called the Sleeping Beauty and the world's most beautiful mummy. She was the last body admitted to the catacombs. After 1920, the practice of mummification at the Capuchin catacombs was officially discontinued. No explanation was given at the time. The commonly accepted reason is that changing cultural attitudes made the practice seem outdated. But there is another explanation, one that was sent to me by a person I cannot name, a person who was, until recently, associated with the Capuchin order in Palermo, a person who has since left the order and left Sicily. This person contacted me anonymously. They provided details that I was able to partially verify through public records and published academic sources. I will present their account without identifying them. This person told me that Rosalia Lombardo was not simply the last body to be mummified. She was the last body needed. The Capuchin monks had maintained a count since 1599, since Brother Silvestro of Gubbio. Every body that entered the catacombs was recorded in a ledger. The ledger was not a simple registry. It included the position of each body within the corridors, the angle of its placement, the direction it faced, and a number. The number corresponded to a diagram that was older than the monastery, older than the Capuchin order, a diagram that the monks had found when they first excavated the catacombs in 1599 and broke through the wall of a chamber that had been sealed since the Arab period. Inside that chamber, they found two things. The first was a stone tablet carved with Phoenician text. The text was partially translated by a scholar the monks consulted in secret. It described a ritual of containment, the creation of a prison of eyes. The tablet specified a number, the number of watchers required to maintain the containment. It specified their arrangement, their orientation, and the geometry of the corridors they would occupy. The number on the tablet was 8004. The second thing they found in the chamber, below the tablet, was a door that was not made of wood or stone or any material the monks recognized, a door that was warm, that vibrated, that smelled of sulfur and salt and something organic that none of them could name, a door that something was behind. The monks sealed the outer chamber and began the work the tablet prescribed. They built the corridors in the shape specified by the diagram. They began filling them with watchers, bodies preserved with open eyes, aimed at the center, aimed at the door. For 321 years, from 1599 to 1920, the monks mummified the dead of Palermo and placed them in the spiral, not as a service to grieving families, not as a cultural practice, as construction, building a prison, one body at a time, one pair of eyes at a time. The person who contacted me said the ledger showed that body number 8003 was interred in October 1920. One more was needed. Mario Lombardo brought his dead daughter to the monastery on December 6, 1920. He asked for her to be preserved. He had no idea what he was providing. He thought he was honoring his child. The monks accepted the body. They called Alfredo Salafia. They paid for the most advanced preservation technique available because body number 8004 was the last, the final watcher, the keystone of the prison. She had to be perfect. She had to last. Salafia's formula was extraordinary. Rosalia's preservation surpassed every other body in the catacombs by a margin that science still struggles to explain. A 2-year-old girl, dead for over 100 years, who looks like she is sleeping. She was placed in a glass coffin at the deepest point of the catacombs, in the chapel adjacent to the locked door. The chapel that tourists walk through quickly, taking photographs, remarking on the miracle of preservation. They don't understand the position. They don't understand the angle. They don't understand why Rosalia is there, at the innermost point of the spiral, with her face aimed directly at the wall behind which the sealed door stands. She is the final watcher, the closest to the door, the one whose gaze holds the last few meters, and her eyes open. This is documented, photographed, studied. Time-lapse cameras installed in her chapel have captured the phenomenon repeatedly. Rosalia's eyes appear to open slightly and close again. The movement is small, a few millimeters. The camera captures it over hours. The scientific explanation is humidity changes, temperature fluctuations causing the dried tissue of the eyelids to contract and expand slightly. The person who contacted me offered a different explanation. They said the eyes open when the thing behind the door moves, when it tests the containment, when it pushes against the boundary of sight that 8,000 watchers create. Rosalia's eyes are the indicator, the alarm system. When her eyes are open, the containment holds. When they close, even for a moment, the thing behind the door advances, a centimeter, a millimeter, whatever distance it can cover in the gap between one blink and the next. The person told me that the monks monitor Rosalia's eyes, not with time-lapse cameras. In person, a monk is assigned to sit in the chapel during the hours when the catacombs are closed to the public, nighttime, when no tourists' gaze supplements the watchers, when the only eyes on the corridor are the dead ones. One living monk, watching Rosalia, watching her eyes. And if her eyes close, the monk does not look away, because if the monk looks away when Rosalia's eyes are closed, there is nothing between the door and the surface. No watcher, no witness, no gaze. The person told me they served this duty for 7 years. 7 years of sitting in a chapel at 2 a.m, watching the face of a dead child, waiting for her eyes to move. They told me that in 7 years, Rosalia's eyes closed 14 times. Each time, the monk on duty heard something. From behind the wall, from behind the door they could not see but knew was there. A sound that was not breathing, not movement, something worse. Anticipation. The sound of something that knows the eyes are closed, that knows the gap is open, that is calculating whether the gap is wide enough, whether the darkness is deep enough, whether this, finally, is the moment. 14 times. In 7 years, the monk sat in the dark chapel and listened to that calculation and waited for Rosalia's eyes to open again. They always opened, within seconds, within a minute at most. But each time, the person told me, the gap lasted a little longer than the time before, and the sound from behind the wall was a little closer. The person left the order in 2024. They told me they could not do another winter, another mercatid of the soul, sitting in a chapel beneath a monastery, watching a dead child's eyes, listening to something behind a wall inch closer each time the eyes closed. They told me the monks are struggling to maintain the vigil. The order is shrinking. Fewer young men enter the Capuchin Brotherhood each year. The duty is difficult to explain to novices, difficult to justify to superiors who consider the old practices superstition. The person's final message to me contained a single paragraph. Rosalia is the lock. Her eyes are the key. When the monks can no longer maintain the vigil, when there is no one sitting in that chapel at 2 a.m, when her eyes close and no living witness sees them close, the door will open. Not the wooden door the tourists never see. The other door, the one beneath it, the one the Phoenicians built and the Arabs sealed and the Capuchins have guarded for 400 years. 8,000 watchers and one sleeping child. That is all that stands between it and the surface. And the watchers are turning away, one by one, year by year. The oldest ones, the ones closest to the door. Their heads are shifting, their eyes are moving. Something is making them look away. When the last one turns, when Rosalia closes her eyes and no one is there to see it, it won't need the corridor, it won't need the stairs, it won't need the monastery. It will simply be here, in the city, in the streets, in the light. Because after 3,000 years in the dark, it will have learned something the Phoenicians didn't think was possible. It will have learned how to move while being watched. The Capuchin Catacombs are open to the public 6 days a week. You can visit them for €3. You can walk the corridors. You can look at the bodies. You can take photographs of the mummies in their centuries-old clothes, with their dried skin and their open mouths and their hollow, staring eyes. You can visit Rosalia Lombardo. You can stand in front of her glass coffin and marvel at the preservation. A child who looks like she fell asleep yesterday. You can photograph her face, her blonde hair, the yellow ribbon, And if you stand there long enough, if you watch her closely, you might see it. A flicker, a tremor in the eyelids, the slightest motion. The guides will tell you it's humidity, temperature, a trick of the light. But if you look at the wall behind her coffin, the blank wall at the deepest point of the catacombs, you might feel something that the guides won't explain. Warmth, faint but present, coming from behind the stone. And if you press your ear to that wall, in the silence between one tour group's footsteps and the next, you might hear something. Not breathing, not movement, something closer to patience, the sound of something that has been waiting for 3,000 years. That has been inches from the surface for centuries. That is held in place by the gaze of the dead and the eyes of a sleeping child. Something that is learning, slowly, to move in the light. 8,000 watchers, 14 blinks a year, a gap that grows longer each time. The math is not difficult if you've had an experience in the catacombs of Palermo or in any place where the dead don't seem to rest. Send me your story. The link is in the description. Sleep well tonight.